Hello and welcome to this video lecture. In this video, we'll be talking about tips. 1. Background of tips. While going through hundreds of DS problems, I not only came up with the variable approach, but also found many frequently appearing patterns on the exam. I have put the most common of them together as tips. These tips appear regardless of the difficulty level of the question and help students solve DS questions with the variable approach. All of my tips are based on my years of experience examining the questions and applying induction. These tips are the most valuable logic, along with the variable approach and 4 common mistake types. Memorize them carefully. Tips are the rules that I found when I developed the variable approach and studied the logic. They will be your greatest help in the actual exam. 2. Types of tips. I have devised 5 types of tips. Tip 1 states that if the value of condition 1 and the value of condition 2 are the same, then D would be the most probable answer. Tip 2 and Tip 3 are related to the variable approach. Tip 4 states that if the conditions are too trivial, they cannot be the answer, while Tip 5 applies to the high-level difficulty questions. 3. Roles of tips. The role of these tips is to enhance the efficacy of the variable approach, and therefore should not be read independently of the variable approach method. Tip 1 usually appears on high difficulty level problems. It says that if the value from condition 1 and the value from condition 2 are the same, D would most likely be the answer. Tip 1 plays a critical and powerful role in solving DS questions accurately on the GMAT. Memorize Tip 1 and apply it in the actual exam. It is 95% likely that you would get the right answer. Tips support the variable approach to solve DS questions more efficiently. While applying the variable approach to DS questions, Tip 1, Tip 2, and Tip 3 increase the likelihood of answering the questions correctly. Next, tips shed light on understanding the common mistake types. Tip 4 is usually connected to CMT 3 and CMT 4A and B. Tip 4 is related to 50 to 51 level questions. Finally, Tip 5 helps in solving the highest level complex questions and is effective when guessing answers. If a question deals with an equality, conditions with equations would most likely be the answer. So, knowing Tip 5 actually increases the likelihood of answering questions correctly. Tip 5 is useful when you don't have any idea how to solve a certain question. 4. Characteristics of tips. Now let's look at the characteristics of these tips. I have based these tips on the pattern seen in the GMAT official guide, so you can apply these tips to 60% of the DS questions that you are likely to come across. Next, tips can be immediately applied to solving DS questions. For example, according to Tip 1, D would be the most likely answer if you see that the value from condition 1 and the value from condition 2 are the same. Also, according to Tip 5, a condition with an equation is likely to be the answer if you are looking at an inequality question in DS. Tips were created by analyzing recent exams so that you can apply them during your exam. Next, tips, like the VA, can be applied only to the DS questions and not to the PS questions. Also, these 5 tips are not independent of each other, but are related to each other, making it important to learn the relationships between them. An additional tip, not included in these 5, which is very effective in solving DS questions, is that a condition with a ratio is more likely to be the answer than a condition with numbers. This tip appeared quite frequently on recent GMAT exams. If you correctly understand the variable approach, CMTs, and tips, the GMAT Math DS questions are a piece of cake. 5. How to use tips. Tips can be applied immediately when solving DS problems. The first step of the variable approach is to change the original condition and the question and recheck. The second step is to count the number of variables and the number of equations. If the value of condition 1 turns out to be equal to the value of condition 2, that is, condition 1 equals condition 2, D would most likely be the answer. This is how to apply a tip while using the variable approach to a DS question. Tip 1 is very powerful, so memorize it carefully. When the variable approach is applied, it is quite possible that the question is too complicated to count the number of variables and the number of equations. In this case, try to use tip 5 if the question deals with an equality, and there is a condition with an equation. The condition with an equation is most likely the answer. If there is a question about integers, statistics, probability, inequality, or absolute value, use tip 4, which states that a trivial condition cannot be the answer. Also, when using tip 4, remember that it is related to CMT3 and CMT4A and B. Isn't that fantastic? The variable approach is great by itself, but we also created the CMTs and tips. Don't you think we have the bragging right? Tip 2 and Tip 3 are about the relationship between variables and equations from an original condition. Therefore, these tips should be applied immediately upon starting each question. These tips save you time and guarantee you a high score in the actual exam, so memorize them carefully. Remember that there are 5 tips.